In a small Amish settlement in 1887, a farmer named Jakob Miller did something that would be whispered about for generations at the community's bride market, where eligible women stood nervously as prospective husbands made their choices. Jakob stunned everyone by paying triple the asking price for the heaviest and most ridiculed woman there. While others sought beauty and grace, he saw something different in Ruth Brenneman. The community called him foolish. They said he'd wasted his life savings on a woman no one wanted. But what happened next would change everything. The children born from that unlikely union would grow to become the most powerful family the town had ever known. How did the most scorned marriage in the settlement's history produce the children who now rule? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The settlement of Maple Hollow sat in a quiet fold of Pennsylvania countryside, where rolling hills met dense woodlands, and the air carried the perpetual scent of turned earth and wood smoke. It was 1887, and the world beyond those hills was changing rapidly, but here, time moved at the pace of seasons and the rhythm of horse hooves on packed dirt roads. The Amish, who lived there, had carved out their existence through generations of hard work, their farms spreading across the valley like patchwork quilts, each field representing a family's legacy and livelihood. Jakob Miller's farm occupied a modest stretch of land on the eastern edge of the settlement, where the morning sun rose over his barn before touching any other structure in Maple Hollow. He was 32 years old that autumn, weathered beyond his years from a life spent working the soil his father and grandfather had worked before him. His hands were calloused and strong, his shoulders broad from lifting hay bales and guiding the plow behind stubborn oxen, but it was his eyes that set him apart from other men in the settlement. They were thoughtful, observant, always seeming to see something others missed. The farm itself reflected Jakob's character. Everything was orderly but not ostentatious, functional but well-maintained. The barn stood sturdy and straight, its red paint faded but sound. The house, a simple two-story structure with white clapboard siding, sat back from the road surrounded by a split-rail fence that Jakob repaired each spring. Inside, the rooms were sparse, furnished with pieces his mother had chosen before the fever took her, and his father both, 7 years earlier. Jakob had inherited not just the land, but also a way of seeing the world that his father had instilled in him since childhood. The old man, Wilhelm Miller, had been known throughout Maple Hollow as fair-minded and kind, a man who treated everyone with dignity regardless of their station or circumstances. Jakob remembered sitting on the porch as a boy, watching his father share water and bread with a traveling family whose wagon had broken down on their road. Other farmers had turned them away, suspicious of outsiders, but Wilhelm had helped them mend the wheel and sent them off with provisions. "Son," his father had said that evening, his voice quiet but firm. "Most folks look at a thing and see only what's on the surface. They see a broken wagon and dirty clothes and decide those people aren't worth their time. But a wise man looks deeper. He sees a family trying to build a better life, same as us. He sees their worth beyond their circumstances." That lesson had shaped Jakob more than any scripture or sermon. Now living alone on the farm, he found himself thinking often of his father's words, especially as the years passed and the settlement's expectations weighed more heavily upon him. The Amish community of Maple Hollow operated under strict social hierarchies and traditions that governed every aspect of life. At the top sat the Elder Council, 5 men chosen for their age, wisdom and adherence to the old ways. Chief among them was Elder Thomas Yoder, a stern man of 60, whose interpretation of Scripture left little room for grace or flexibility. Yoder had led the settlement for nearly 2 decades, his word carrying the weight of divine authority in the minds of most residents. Below the council came the established families, those whose names appeared on the original land grants and whose farms had prospered through careful management and favorable matches. Then came the working families, respectable but less influential, followed by the unmarried adults, who existed in a state of social limbo until they fulfilled their expected roles as husbands and wives. Jakob occupied an uncomfortable position in this hierarchy. His family name carried respect, his farm produced adequate yields, and his character was beyond reproach. Yet he remained unmarried at an age when most men had wives and several children. This made him the subject of whispered conversations and concerned looks from the church women, who believed a man alone was a man incomplete. The truth was, Jakob had been invited to the quarterly bride market since he turned 25. These gatherings, held in the settlement's largest barn, served as formal introductions between unmarried men and women. The women would stand in a line dressed in their finest dresses, while the men walked past, evaluating, considering, making their choices. A price would be set for each woman, based on her family's standing, her skills, and her prospects as a wife. The man would pay this price to the woman's family, and the marriage would be arranged. Jakob had attended 7 such markets over the year. Each time he had walked the line, seeing the young women with their downcast eyes and nervous smiles. They were pretty enough, these girls, most of them barely 20 years old. Their families spoke highly of their cooking and sewing, their obedience and piety. But Jakob always walked away without making a choice, unable to articulate what he was looking for, but knowing he hadn't found it. The settlement interpreted his reluctance as a personal eccentricity at best, prideful pickiness at worst. Sarah Kaufman, a widow who lived on the neighboring farm, had tried to understand. She was one of the few people Jakob counted as a true friend, someone whose husband had died young and who had learned to see past surface judgments through her own experience of loss and struggle. "They think you're waiting for perfection," Sarah had told him one afternoon as they both worked at mending fence lines between their properties, "or that you're too particular about a woman's looks." Jakob had hammered another nail into the post before responding. "I'm waiting for someone real," he said simply. "All those young girls, they're playing a role they've been taught, smiling just so, standing just right. I want to see who someone actually is, not who they've been trained to be." Sarah had studied him with knowing eyes. "You're looking for what your parents had," she said softly. "That's rare, Jakob. Your father saw your mother, truly, and she saw him. Most marriages here start with duty and hopefully grow into something warmer. You want to start with recognition." She was right, though Jakob had never put it into words quite that way. He wanted what his father had taught him to value, the ability to see beneath the surface, to recognize worth that others overlook. As the autumn of 1887 approached, bringing with it another bride market, the pressure on Jakob intensified. Elder Yoda had taken to mentioning during church services, in carefully veiled language, the importance of men fulfilling their obligations to continue the community's growth. The older women had become more pointed in their suggestions, introducing Jakob to visiting cousins or conveniently arranging encounters with unmarried daughters. Jakob felt the weight of these expectations, but could not bring himself to choose a wife simply to satisfy others. His evenings were spent alone in the house, eating simple dinners at the kitchen table his father had built, reading by lamplight from the few books he kept hidden in the barn. The settlement discouraged reading beyond scripture, but Jakob's father had quietly accumulated a small collection of books on philosophy and natural science, and Jakob had continued the practice. On these quiet nights, sitting in the pool of yellow light cast by his lamp, Jakob sometimes wondered if he was being foolish. Perhaps he should simply choose one of the pleasant young women at the next market, pay the asking price, and begin the life everyone expected of him. Perhaps his father's lesson about seeing deeper had been meant for judging character in friends and neighbors, not for something as important as choosing a wife. But then he would remember his mother's face as she looked at his father, the way their hands found each other across the table, the quiet conversations they shared in the evenings. That was what he wanted. That recognition, that partnership built on truly seeing one another. As October arrived and the leaves began their transformation from green to gold and crimson, Notices went up announcing the bride market. It would be held on the third Saturday of the month, as tradition dictated. Jakob saw the announcement posted at the general store and felt the familiar mixture of obligation and resistance rise in his chest. This time, he told himself, he would make a choice. He was 32 years old, established in his farm, capable of supporting a family. It was time to set aside his peculiar notions and do what was expected. He would attend the market, evaluate the women presented, and select a suitable wife. He would pay the asking price, whatever it was, and begin building the life the community demanded of him. It was a practical decision, a mature decision. Jakob repeated this to himself as the days passed and the market drew closer. He repeated it as he completed his fall chores, preparing his home for the possibility of a new occupant. He repeated it as he counted out his savings, money inherited from his parents and carefully preserved through years of cautious spending. What Jakob didn't know, couldn't have known as he made these practical plans, was that the October bride market of 1887 would change not only his life, but the entire temperature of Maple Hollow's future. Standing at the end of that line of nervous young women would be someone he had noticed before, but never truly seen. And this time, perhaps because he had finally decided to stop looking so hard for what he wanted, he would see her clearly. Her name was Ruth Brenneman, and she was about to become the most important decision Jakob Miller would ever make. The morning of the October bride market dawned cool and clear, the kind of autumn day that made Pennsylvania beautiful. Frost touched the edges of the grass, melting quickly as the sun climbed higher, and the air carried the sweet scent of apples from the orchards surrounding the settlement. Jakob rose before dawn, as always, completed his chores with methodical efficiency, and dressed in his finest clothes, a black suit that had belonged to his father and still fit him well. As he drove his cart toward the settlement's center, he passed other families making the same journey. The bride markets drew everyone, not just those directly participating. It was a social event, a chance to visit with neighbors and witness the formation of new families that would strengthen the community's future. Children ran alongside the carts, excited by the break from routine. Women carried baskets of food to share. Men discussed crops and weather, and the likelihood of a harsh winter. The market was held in the Yoder barn, the largest structure in Maple Hollow, with high ceilings and space enough for the entire settlement to gather. By the time Jakob arrived, dozens of carts already lined the road, and the sound of conversation drifted from the open doors. He tied his horse to the rail and stood for a moment, gathering his resolve. Today, he would make a choice. Today, he would do his duty. Inside, the barn had been swept clean and decorated with bundles of dried corn stalks and late-blooming flowers. Long tables held food contributions from various families, and the sweet smell of fresh bread and apple pies competed with the earthier scents of hay and livestock. The unmarried women stood along one side of the barn, arranged in a line from youngest to oldest, each wearing her best dress, each trying to appear both modest and appealing. Jakob recognized most of them. There was Emma Stoltzfors, 19 years old, daughter of a prosperous farmer, known for her skill with a needle. Next to her stood Anna Byler, 21, whose family owned the mill and whose dowry would be substantial. Further down the line were Mary Lapp, Rachel King, and half a dozen others, all young, all suitable, all carefully prepared for this moment. Elder Yoder stood at the front of the barn, his presence commanding attention without him needing to speak. He was a tall man, thin and angular, with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed to weigh and judge everything they saw. When the crowd had settled and the unmarried men had gathered near the women's line, Yoder raised his hand for silence. "We gather today in the sight of God and this community," he began, his voice carrying easily through the barn, "to join our young people in the blessed state of marriage. The men here will make their choices according to our traditions, and the families will receive fair compensation for the loss of their daughters' labor. Let us proceed with dignity and respect. The process began as it always did. The men walked slowly past the line of women, sometimes pausing to speak briefly with a father, or to ask a woman a simple question about her skills or preferences. Then the choosing started with the youngest men first, those making their first selections, nervous and uncertain. Young David Stoltzfus, barely 23, chose Emma, his own distant cousin. The price was set at $12, a respectable sum, and David paid it with shaking hands to Emma's father. Applause rippled through the crowd as the first match was made. Then came Peter Zook, who selected Anna Byler after a whispered conversation with her father about the mill's future. Her price was $15, reflecting her family's status. One by one, the younger women were chosen, and the line grew shorter. Jakob watched the process with a familiar sense of detachment, waiting for his turn. As an older, established farmer, he would choose after the younger men, but before the elders who occasionally sought second wives after being widowed. Then, as the line dwindled to just 4 women, Jakob noticed something that stopped him. At the very end of the line stood Ruth Brenneman, and for the first time he truly saw her. Ruth was 28 years old, just 4 years younger than Jakob, but she had been to 6 bride markets before this one and never been chosen. The reason was immediately apparent to anyone who looked at her. Ruth was heavy, substantially larger than any other woman in the settlement. Where the other women were slender and delicate, Ruth was broad-shouldered and thick-waisted, her dress straining slightly across her middle, despite being cut generously. But that wasn't what stopped Jakob. It was her. While the other women kept their eyes downcast in modest submission, Ruth's eyes were up, looking straight ahead with a mixture of resignation and dignity that pierced something in Jakob's chest. She wasn't trying to appear appealing. She wasn't smiling hopefully or positioning herself to advantage. She was simply standing there, enduring what she knew was coming, which was nothing. Jakob realized with sudden clarity that he had seen Ruth at previous market. She had always been at the end of the line, always been passed over, always been the one who walked home unchosen. He had noticed her the way one notices a familiar landmark, present but unremarkable. Now, seeing her truly for the first time, he recognized something his father had taught him to value, strength of character visible in a person's bearing. The choosing continued. 2 more women were selected, their prices paid, their new lives beginning. Now, only Ruth and 1 other woman remained. A very young girl of barely 18, who looked terrified and was quickly claimed by an older widower looking for help with his 5 children. That left Ruth alone at the end of the line. Elder Yoder walked over to where Ruth stood, his expression a mixture of duty and distaste. "Ruth Brenneman," he announced to the remaining crowd, his voice lacking the warmth he'd shown for the other women. "Daughter of the late Heinrich Brenneman, blacksmith. Age 28, skilled in kitchen work and herb gardening." The description was perfunctory, almost dismissive. No mention of her father's good reputation, no emphasis on any particular qualities. Yoder named the price quickly, as if eager to complete an unpleasant task. $6, he said flatly. $6. Less than half what had been asked for any other woman that day. The insult was clear and intentional. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some sympathetic, others agreeing that even $6 might be too much for a woman of Ruth's size and age. Jakob felt something shift inside him, a clarity descending like the morning sun, burning through fog. He looked at Ruth, still standing with her head up, her jaw set, refusing to show the humiliation she must be feeling. He saw her capable hands, work-roughened and strong. He saw intelligence in her eyes and dignity in her bearing, despite the circumstances. He saw something real and substantial, where others saw only disappointment. In that moment, Jakob understood what his father had been teaching him all those years. This was the test, not finding the prettiest woman or the one with the best dowry, but recognizing worth that others dismissed. Seeing the person beneath the surface judgment, Jakob stepped forward. The crowd quieted, surprised that anyone was moving toward Ruth. He walked deliberately, his footsteps loud in the sudden silence, until he stood directly in front of Elder Yoida. "I'll take Ruth Brenneman as my wife," Jakob said clearly, his voice steady. Yoida's eyebrows rose. "You're certain, Jakob? Perhaps you'd like time to reconsider." "I'm certain," Jakob replied. Then, before Yoida could respond, he added, "And I'll pay $18. The gasp that went through the barn was audible and collective. $18, triple the asking price, more than had been paid for any woman that day, more than most families earned in a month. People turned to their neighbors, whispering urgently. Had Jakob Miller lost his mind? Was this some kind of joke? Elder Yoda's face darkened. "Jakob, the price is $6. There's no need for the price is $18. Jakob interrupted, something he had never done to an elder before. "That's what I'm paying for my wife." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, counting out the coins slowly and deliberately, stacking them in Yoda's reluctant hand. Each coin clinked against the others, the sound echoing in the silent barn. When he finished, 18 silver dollars sat in the elder's palm. Jakob turned to Ruth. For the first time since he'd stepped forward, he looked directly into her eyes. Up close, he could see they were hazel, flecked with gold, and filled with confusion and something that might have been hope. "Ruth Brenneman," he said formally, "will you consent to be my wife?" Ruth's voice, when she finally spoke, was surprisingly steady. "Yes," she said simply. "I will." Jakob extended his hand to her. Ruth hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. Her palm was warm and calloused from work, her grip firm. Jakob helped her step down from the platform where the women had been standing, and together they walked through the crowd toward the barn doors. The crowd parted before them, but the looks on their faces ranged from shock to pity to outright scorn. Jakob heard the whispers as they passed. "He's lost his mind. $18 for that woman. She'll eat him out of house and home within a year." Poor Jakob. The loneliness must have driven him mad. Through it all, Jakob kept his eyes forward and Ruth's hand in his. Behind them he heard Ruth's aunt, the woman who had taken Ruth in after her father died, speaking loudly to her neighbors. "Well, I'm rid of her finally. Cost me more in food than she was worth in work. That fool farmer is welcome to her." Jakob felt Ruth's hand tighten in his, the only sign that the words had struck home. He squeezed back gently, a silent message that he heard her too, that they were in this together now. They reached his cart, and Jakob helped Ruth up onto the seat before untying his horse and climbing up beside her. As he took the reins and guided the horse back onto the road, the noise from the barn swelled behind them. Everyone would be talking about this. The story of Jakob Miller paying triple price for the heaviest woman at market would spread through Maple Hollow and beyond. They would be the subject of gossip and speculation for months, maybe years. The ride back to Jakob's farm was silent at first, both of them processing what had just happened. The autumn countryside rolled past, beautiful and indifferent to human drama. Finally, about halfway home, Ruth spoke. "Why did you do that?" Her voice was quiet but direct, demanding an honest answer. Jakob considered his response carefully. "I saw something others didn't," he said finally. "What could you possibly have seen?" Ruth's tone wasn't bitter, just genuinely curious. "I'm exactly what they say I am. Heavy, old, not pretty, not the kind of wife any man wants." Jakob pulled the horse to a stop in the middle of the empty road. He turned to face Ruth fully, meeting her eyes. "I saw capable hands," he said. "I saw strength. I saw someone who stands with dignity, even when she's being insulted. I saw intelligence in your eyes and character in how you carry yourself. I saw someone real, not someone playing a role." Ruth studied him for a long moment, searching his face for mockery or hidden cruelty. Finding none, Her eyes began to glisten with tears she refused to let fall. "No one has ever seen me that way before," she whispered. "Then everyone else is blind," Jakob said simply. He urged the horse forward again, and they continued toward his farm, toward the beginning of something neither of them could yet imagine. They arrived at Jakob's farm in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the fields. Ruth sat quietly as Jakob helped her down from the cart, then followed him as he showed her the property. The barn first, where he kept 2 milk cows, a team of oxen, chickens, and his plow horse. Then the smokehouse, the root cellar, and finally the house itself. Inside, Ruth saw immediately that Jakob was a man who valued order. Everything had its place, though the house had the unmistakable feeling of a space occupied by someone living alone. No woman's touches softened the bare walls, no curtains hung in the windows. The furniture was functional but sparse. "The bedroom is upstairs," Jakob said, his voice carefully neutral. "There's a spare room as well if you'd prefer your own space. I want you to be comfortable here." Ruth understood what he was offering, a kindness that surprised her. This marriage had been arranged quickly, unconventionally. He was giving her time and space to adjust. "Thank you," she said softly. "The spare room would be good at first." Jakob nodded and showed her upstairs. The spare room was small but clean, with a simple bed and a chest for belongings. Ruth's few possessions brought by Jakob's cart while she'd changed into traveling clothes at her aunt's house sat in a canvas bag by the door. Among them was her most precious possession, a leather-bound book that had belonged to her mother. As Jakob left her to settle in, Ruth sat on the bed and opened the book carefully. It was filled with her mother's handwriting, recipes for food and remedies for illness, accumulated over years and passed down from her own mother. Before her, Ruth had memorized many of these recipes during the years before her mother died when Ruth was 14. The book itself was all she had left of the woman who had taught her that strength came in many forms, and that a person's worth wasn't measured by their appearance. That first evening was awkward, both of them navigating the strangeness of sharing a home with someone they barely knew. Ruth prepared dinner from the supplies Jakob had in his pantry, making a simple stew with vegetables and salt pork. Jakob ate quietly, then surprised her by complimenting the meal. "It's been a long time since I had food that tasted like more than fuel," he said. "You have a gift for cooking. My mother taught me," Ruth replied. She believed food should nourish both body and spirit. They talked a bit more that evening, tentative conversations that revealed small details about each other. Jakob told her about his parents, about his father's philosophy of seeing people truly. Ruth shared memories of her father's blacksmith shop, how she used to watch him work the forge, marveling at his ability to shape raw metal into useful tools. "What happened to the shop after he died?" Jakob asked. Ruth's expression darkened. "Elder Yoda said there were debts. The shop was sold to settle them, and what little remained went to my aunt for taking me in. I never saw any accounting of it." Jakob filed that information away, something about it not sitting right with him, but he said nothing. It was their first evening together, not the time to question the settlement's leadership. The first weeks of their marriage established a pattern. Ruth rose before dawn and had breakfast prepared by the time Jakob came in from his morning chore. She managed the household with an efficiency that impressed him, organizing the pantry, mending his clothes, keeping everything spotlessly clean. But it was more than just housework. Ruth proved to have a mind for practical problem-solving. One afternoon, Jakob found her in the barn studying the way he had arranged his tools. "You're wasting steps," she said without preamble. "If you moved the harnesses closer to the stalls and put the frequently used tools on this wall instead of scattered around, you'd save yourself hours every week." Jakob looked at the barn with fresh eyes and realized she was right. Together, they spent an afternoon reorganizing, and the improvement was immediately noticeable. It was a small thing, but it revealed something important. Ruth saw systems and understood efficiency in a way that went beyond traditional women's work. Jakob also discovered that Ruth was remarkably well read for someone with limited formal education. In the evenings, when he pulled out one of his hidden books, expecting her to disapprove, Ruth instead asked if she might read it when he finished. She worked through his small collection of philosophy and natural science texts, then discussed them with him in conversations that ranged far beyond anything he'd experienced in Maple Hollow. "Most people here would consider these books dangerous," Ruth observed one evening. "Questions lead to doubt, and doubt leads to disobedience." "My father believed questions lead to understanding," Jakob replied, "and understanding leads to wisdom." Ruth smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her face. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was," Jakob agreed. "He would have liked you, but while their home life was developing into something unexpectedly pleasant, the outside world remained hostile. The settlement had not forgiven or forgotten Jakob's choice. Neighbors who had previously been friendly now avoided him. Invitations to community gatherings stopped coming. When Jakob went to the trading post for supplies, conversations died as he entered, then resumed in whispers after he left. The shunning extended to Ruth as well, though she was more accustomed to it. Women who had worked alongside her at community events now turned away when she approached. Children, mimicking their parents' attitudes, sometimes laughed and pointed when she passed. The cruelty was casual and constant. Sarah Kaufman remained the sole exception. The widow appeared at Jakob's door 3 weeks after the wedding, carrying a basket of fresh bread and a determined expression. "I won't pretend the whole settlement hasn't lost its mind over your marriage," Sarah said bluntly as Ruth invited her in. "But I remember what it's like to be judged unfairly. When my husband died and left me with debts, people whispered that I must have mismanaged things, that a proper woman would have prevented his poor decisions. They saw me as a failure instead of a widow doing her best." Ruth poured tea for them both, grateful for a friendly face. "How did you bear it?" "By proving them wrong," Sarah replied. "I worked my farm, paid off the debts, raised my daughter alone. Eventually most of them came around. Not all, but enough." She looked at Ruth appraisingly. "You're stronger than you know, Ruth Miller. I've watched you at gatherings over the years. You kept your dignity when others would have broken. That's rare." The friendship that formed between Ruth and Sarah became a lifeline. Sarah visited regularly, defying social pressure, and Ruth found herself able to talk honestly with another woman for the first time since her mother's death. But not all responses were passive shunning. Elder Yoder made his displeasure known through more active means. 6 weeks after the wedding, he appeared at Jakob's farm unannounced, ostensibly to check on how the new couple was managing. "Jakob Miller," Yoder said, his voice heavy with false concern, "I feel obligated as your elder to inquire about your well-being. The entire settlement is worried about you." "There's no need for worry," Jakob replied evenly. "My wife and I are doing well." Yoder's eyes swept over Ruth, who stood in the doorway of the house, then returned to Jakob with barely concealed contempt. "You've made yourself a laughingstock, Jack. You paid $18 for a woman no man wanted, and now you're isolated from your community. Is this truly the life you envisioned?" Jakob felt Ruth tense behind him, felt the weight of the insult. He stepped forward, placing himself more directly between Yoder and his wife. "I'm satisfied with my choice, Elder," he said firmly. "More than satisfied. I have a capable, intelligent wife who manages my home well and whose company I value. If the community chooses to judge us for that, the failing is theirs, not ours." Yoder's expression hardened. "Pride comes before a fall, Jakob. Remember that." He turned and left without another word, but the threat hung in the air. After Yoder's cart disappeared down the road, Ruth joined Jakob on the porch. "He'll make trouble for us," she said quietly. "Let him try," Jakob replied, but privately, he knew she was right. Yorda was a man who demanded conformity, and Jakob's choice had been an act of rebellion, whether he'd intended it that way or not. As autumn deepened into winter, Jakob and Ruth continued building their unlikely partnership. The first genuine warmth between them came one cold November evening when Jakob returned from the barn to find Ruth stirring a pot over the fire, the smell of apple butter filling the kitchen. It was a scent from his childhood, something his mother used to make. "How did you know to make this?" he asked, surprised by the sudden rush of emotion. "I found your mother's recipe book in the pantry," Ruth admitted. "I thought you might like it." Jakob tasted the apple butter and found it perfect, exactly as he remembered. "It's wonderful," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you, Ruth." For the first time since their wedding, their eyes met and held, and something passed between them that went beyond gratitude or respect. It was the beginning of a connection that neither had expected, but both were beginning to value. Winter preparation brought them even closer together. Ruth's organizational skills ensured they were well stocked with food and fuel. She had a natural talent for preserving and planning that made Jakob realize how much more smoothly his household ran with her in it. But it wasn't just her practical abilities that he appreciated. It was her mind, her observations, her dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to show it. One afternoon, Ruth discovered Jakob's father's journals in the barn, hidden in the same chest where Jakob kept his books. She brought them to him that evening, her expression curious. "May I read these?" she asked. "Or are they too personal?" Jakob considered, then nodded. "My father wrote them for my mother originally, his thoughts and philosophies. After she died, he continued writing them for me. I think he'd be glad to know someone else was reading them." Ruth spent the next several evenings absorbed in Wilhelm Miller's journals, occasionally reading passages aloud that particularly struck her. The old man's wisdom and compassion came through clearly in his writing, his belief that every person possessed inherent worth that had nothing to do with their circumstances or appearance. "Your father was right," Ruth said one night, closing the journal carefully. "Worth isn't determined by what others see. It's what we carry inside ourselves." She looked at Jakob directly. "You learned his lessons well. You saw worth in me when no one else did, even when I had stopped seeing it in myself." Jakob moved to sit beside her. "I saw what was there," he said simply. "What had always been there." Ruth's hand found his on the table, their fingers intertwining naturally. It was the first deliberate touch between them since their wedding day, and it felt right. Over the following weeks, they drew closer, their partnership deepening into something that resembled the marriages Jakob had always hoped for. The winter evenings became a cherished time. Jakob would read aloud while Ruth mended or worked on her own projects, or they would simply sit together by the fire talking about everything and nothing. The physical distance between them gradually closed. Ruth moved from the spare room to sharing Jakob's bed, and their marriage became complete in every sense. But even as their private world grew warmer, the outside world remained cold. Samuel Brenneman, Ruth's cousin, proved to be particularly venomous in his attacks on the couple. He spread rumors through the settlement, claiming that Ruth had used unnatural means to trap Jakob, that she was eating him out of house and home, that their marriage was a disgrace to the community. The rumors reached Jakob through Sarah Kaufman, who felt he should know what was being said. "Samuel's telling people that Ruth bewitched you," Sarah reported, her tone apologetic. "He's claiming she used herbs and potions to cloud your judgment." Ruth, overhearing this, laughed bitterly. "Samuel proposed to me years ago, before my father died. I refused him, because I could see the cruelty in his heart. This is his revenge for that rejection, I suppose." Jakob absorbed this information, filing it away with his growing concerns about certain members of the settlement's leadership. But for now, his focus remained on the life he and Ruth were building together, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, shared moment by shared moment. By the time the first snow fell in December, blanketing the farm in white silence, Jakob and Ruth stood together on their porch, watching it accumulate. Jakob's arm was around Ruth's shoulders, and she leaned into him naturally, comfortably. "Do you regret it?" Ruth asked quietly. "The isolation, the gossip, paying all that money for me?" Jakob pulled her closer. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You're the best choice I ever made, Ruth Miller. The only choice that truly mattered." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "I spent years thinking I had no value, that I was a burden everyone endured. You showed me I was wrong. Whatever comes next, whatever troubles we face, that gift is worth everything." They stood together as the snow continued to fall, two people who had found in each other something unexpected and precious: recognition, partnership, and the beginning of love. The settlement might judge them, neighbors might shun them, but within the walls of their home they had built something real and strong. Neither of them knew yet that the strength of their union would be tested far beyond social disapproval. Neither of them imagined that from their unlikely marriage would come children who would reshape the very community that had scorned their parents. But as they stood in the falling snow, they understood something fundamental. They had chosen each other, truly chosen, and that choice had changed both of their lives forever. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal, and with it came news that changed everything. Ruth stood in the kitchen one morning, her hand resting on her belly, and told Jakob she was carrying their child. The quiet joy that spread across his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have had about their marriage. The settlement's reaction to Ruth's pregnancy provided more fodder for gossip. Women whispered predictions of difficulties, suggesting that a woman of Ruth's size would surely struggle with childbirth. Elder Yoder made pointed comments during services about the responsibilities of bringing children into the world and ensuring they were raised properly. But Ruth ignored the talk and focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. Her pregnancy proved remarkably strong. While other women in the settlement took to their beds during the later months, Ruth continued working the farm alongside Jakob. Her strength became evident in ways that surprised even those who had known her for years. She could lift heavy loads, work from dawn to dusk, and still manage the household with the same efficiency she'd shown from the beginning. It was during this time that Ruth began creating something that would eventually silence many of her critics. A garden unlike any other in Maple Hollow. Using knowledge passed down from her mother and grandmother, Ruth planted not just vegetables but medicinal herbs. She knew which plants could reduce fever, which could ease the pain of childbirth, which could settle an upset stomach or help a wound heal cleanly. The garden became Ruth's domain, a place where her knowledge and capabilities were visible for anyone willing to see. She worked the soil with a spade that had belonged to her mother, turning the earth and planting with careful precision. Jakob watched her sometimes from the field, marveling at how she seemed to know instinctively what each plant needed. Sarah Kaufman visited one afternoon and found Ruth in the garden, her hands deep in the soil despite being 6 months pregnant. "You should be resting," Sarah scolded gently. "I rest when I need to," Ruth replied, not looking up from her work. "Right now, these plants need tending. Besides, the work settles my mind." Sarah studied the garden with appreciation. "My grandmother grew healing herbs. Most of that knowledge has been lost in our settlement. The women now rely on the doctor from town, but he's expensive and often too far away when needed. My mother believed every family should know basic remedies," Ruth said, finally sitting back on her heels. "She taught me everything she knew. I've been thinking of writing it all down, preserving it the way she preserved her recipes." "You should," Sarah encouraged, "and perhaps teach others. There are women who would welcome that knowledge." Elder Yoder's disapproval notwithstanding, the opportunity to prove the garden's worth came sooner than expected. Sarah's young daughter, Anna, fell ill with a dangerous fever that seemed to come from nowhere. The child's temperature spiked alarmingly, and Sarah, frightened, rode to Ruth's farm in the middle of the night. "Please," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. "The doctor is 2 days away. I don't know what else to do." Ruth didn't hesitate. Despite being heavy with child, she gathered supplies from her garden and rode back with Sarah. She spent the entire night at Anna's bedside, applying cool compresses infused with feverfew and giving the child small doses of willow bark tea. Jakob came to check on them at dawn, finding Ruth still alert and attentive, monitoring every change in the girl's condition. By midday, Anna's fever had broken. The child woke, asking for water and food. The crisis passed. Sarah wept with relief and gratitude, embracing Ruth tightly. "You saved her life," Sarah said simply. "I know it, and I'll make sure others know it too." Word of Anna's recovery spread through the settlement. Sarah made no secret of how her daughter had been healed, praising Ruth's knowledge and skill to anyone who would listen. The response was mixed. Some people, particularly younger families, became curious about Ruth's remedies. Others, led by Elder Yoda, viewed her healing abilities with suspicion. Elder Yoda called a meeting of the council specifically to discuss what he termed concerns about Ruth Miller's activities. Jakob was summoned to appear before the 5 elders, a serious matter that carried the weight of potential judgment and discipline. The meeting took place in the church building, a plain structure with hard wooden benches and no adornment. The 5 elders sat at a table facing Jakob, their expressions grave. Yoda led the questioning, his tone suggesting he had already reached his conclusions. "Jakob Miller, your wife practices healing arts that some in our community find troubling," Yoda began. "She uses plants and preparations that are not familiar to us. There are whispers of unnatural knowledge, of things that might not be appropriate for a godly woman." Jakob felt anger rise in his chest, but kept his voice level. "My wife heals the sick while others merely judge. She saved Anna Kaufman's life when the child would have died waiting for a doctor. She uses knowledge passed down from her mother and grandmother, remedies that have been used for generations. There is nothing unnatural about helping people." Another elder, Thomas Byler, spoke more gently. "We understand your wife helped the Kaufman child, but Elder Yoda raises valid concerns about knowledge that seems unusual. How did Ruth come by these abilities? From her mother, who learned from her mother before her." Jakob explained, "It's healing knowledge, not witchcraft. Feverfew to reduce fever, willow bark for pain, chamomile to settle stomachs. These are plants God created for our use. My wife simply knows how to use them properly." The discussion went on for over an hour, with Yoda pushing for restrictions on Ruth's healing and other elders asking more reasonable questions. Jakob defended his wife with an eloquence that surprised even himself, drawing on his father's teachings about seeing true worth and not judging based on fear or misunderstanding. Finally, Sarah Kaufman requested permission to speak. It was unusual for a woman to address the council, but given that her daughter's life was at the center of the discussion, permission was granted. "My daughter is alive because of Ruth Miller," Sarah stated firmly. "I'll not stand silent while her gift is questioned. If helping the sick is wrong, then I want no part of what's right." Her testimony, combined with Jakob's defense, created a division among the elders. 3 of them, including Thomas Byler, saw value in Ruth's skills. 2, led by Yoda, remained opposed. A compromise was reached. Ruth could continue her healing work, but she would be observed by the community. Any complaints or concerns would be grounds for further action. Jakob left the meeting frustrated but relieved. Ruth could continue helping people, though the threat of future interference hung over them like a cloud. When he told Ruth about the meeting, she absorbed the information calmly. "They fear what they don't understand," she said. "But I won't stop helping people who need. If that brings trouble, so be it." 2 months later, Ruth went into labor. Jakob stayed with her throughout, ignoring tradition that said men had no place in the birthing room. Ruth's labor was long and difficult, her strength tested in ways even she hadn't anticipated. But when their daughter finally arrived just before dawn, healthy and strong, both parents wept with joy and relief. They named her Leah, after Ruth's mother. The baby was sturdy and solid, inheriting her mother's build and her father's thoughtful eye. From her first moments, Leah seemed unusually alert, taking in her surroundings with an awareness that fascinated her parents. The settlement watched the child carefully, some waiting for signs of abnormality, others genuinely curious about how the daughter of such an unusual union would develop. But Leah thrived. She was healthy, content, and as the months passed, showed signs of remarkable intelligence. At 6 months, Leah could sit steadily and reach for objects with precision. At 9 months, she was pulling herself up and taking steps. By her first birthday, she was walking confidently and babbling in what seemed like actual attempts at conversation rather than random sounds. Ruth and Jakob's joy in their daughter was profound and uncomplicated. They saw in Leah the fruit of their unlikely union, proof that their choice to see past surface judgments had produced something beautiful. But more than that, they recognized in their child a person of substance, someone who would grow into her own unique strength. Jakob's love for Ruth deepened with each passing day. What had begun as recognition and respect had transformed into something far more profound. He found himself falling in love with his wife in ways he had never anticipated, not just for what she could do, but for who she was at her core. One evening, as they sat together watching Leah play on the floor, Jakob turned to Ruth and spoke from his heart. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Ruth looked at him with surprise, then something that might have been pain. "You don't have to say things like that, Jakob. I know what I am." "No," Jakob insisted, taking her hand. "You don't know what I see. I see strength in your shoulders that can carry more than anyone gives you credit for. I see intelligence in your eyes that outshines anyone in this settlement. I see hands that heal and nurture and create." The revelation that Jakob had paid $18, with Yoda pocketing all of it while claiming Ruth was worthless, made Jakob's blood boil. His wife had been cheated of her inheritance and then sold like spoiled goods by a man who had stolen from her family. "We have to bring this to the full council," David said, his voice tight with anger. "This corruption has poisoned everything." They carefully copied several pages of the secret ledger, then returned it to its hiding place. The next morning, Jakob requested an emergency council meeting, claiming he had discovered evidence of serious wrongdoing that affected the entire settlement. The meeting was held that afternoon, with all 5 council members present. Jakob laid out what he and David had found, presenting the copied pages and explaining how Judah had systematically stolen from the community for years. The room fell silent as the evidence was examined, the other elders' faces growing progressively dark. Judah tried to deny everything at first, claiming the second ledger was a forgery, that Jakob had manufactured evidence because of some personal grudge. But the details were too specific, too accurate. When confronted with entries that only Judah could have known about, his defenses crumbled. "I kept it for the community," he finally said, his voice weak. "In case of emergencies, I was safeguarding the funds. By hiding them in your own accounts," Thomas Byler demanded, "by falsifying records and stealing from families in need. This is theft. Pure and simple." The full council convened to determine Judah's fate and the settlement's path forward. Word spread quickly through Maple Hollow, and families gathered in small groups, shocked by the revelations of corruption that had infected their community for so long. The man they had trusted to guide them spiritually and administratively had betrayed them in the most fundamental ways. Judah was stripped of his position immediately. The council demanded full restitution of the stolen funds, though it would take years for him to repay what he had taken. He was forbidden from holding any leadership position and faced the prospect of being shunned by the very community he had led. For a man like Judah, whose identity was wrapped up in his authority and respect, it was a crushing fall. But Judah's removal created a vacuum. The settlement needed leadership, needed someone to guide them through the crisis and rebuild trust that had been shattered. The remaining council members held emergency discussions about how to proceed. Thomas Byler approached Jakob 3 days after Judah's removal. The older man's expression was serious, but respectful. "The council would like to nominate you for Elder Judah's vacant seat," he said without preamble. We've discussed it thoroughly. You showed courage in exposing the corruption, wisdom in how you handled the investigation, and integrity throughout. The settlement needs that kind of leadership." Jakob was stunned. He had never sought power or position, preferring the quiet life of his farm. "I'm only 34 years old," he protested. "There are men with far more experience who would be better suited." "Experience isn't always wisdom," Byler replied. "Your father taught you to see truly, to value people beyond surface judgments. That's exactly what this community needs right now. We need someone who won't repeat Yoda's mistakes, someone who leads with transparency and fairness." Ruth encouraged him when he shared the news that evening. "You've been leading without realizing it," she said, bouncing young Miriam on her knee while Leah and Samuel played nearby. "The younger farmers already come to you for advice. People trust you because you've never pretended to be more than you are. That's rare, Jakob." The settlement held a vote the following week. Jakob was elected to the council by an overwhelming margin, becoming the youngest elder in Maple Hollow's history. With the position came a carved wooden seal, pressed into wax to authenticate official documents. Jakob accepted it with mixed feelings, understanding the weight of responsibility it represented. Ruth's role, while not official, became equally important. Everyone knew that Jakob consulted his wife on matters large and small, that her insights shaped his decisions. Women began seeking Ruth's counsel not just for healing but for advice on household management, child rearing, and even matters of family conflict. Her kitchen table became an informal gathering place where problems were discussed and solutions found. As spring arrived and the settlement began to recover from Yoda's corruption, Jakob implemented reforms. He insisted on transparent accounting, with monthly reports available for any member to examine. He established fair market practices for all trades, not just bride prices. He promoted cooperation and shared resources, creating a community fund that truly served the community rather than enriching its administrator. The changes were popular with most families, especially the younger generation who had grown weary of the old guard's rigid control. But not everyone welcomed the new direction. Some of the older families, comfortable with traditional hierarchies, resented the shift in power. Chief among the discontented was Samuel Brenneman, Ruth's cousin, whose bitterness had only grown as the Miller family's influence expanded. Samuel had watched Jakob and Ruth rise from social outcasts to the most respected couple in the settlement. His own life had gone in the opposite direction. His farm struggled, his marriage was unhappy, and his standing in the community had declined. He blamed Jakob and Ruth for his misfortunes, convinced that their success had somehow caused his failures. Samuel began gathering others who shared his resentment. There were men who disliked taking advice from a woman like Ruth, men who felt threatened by Jakob's reforms, men who preferred the old ways where influence came from family connections rather than demonstrated ability. Samuel cultivated these grievances, turning individual complaints into organized opposition. He was careful at first, never openly challenging Jakob's authority, but working behind the scenes to undermine confidence in the new leadership. He spread subtle rumors, raised quiet objections, and positioned himself as the voice of tradition against dangerous change. The Miller children continued to grow in ways that fascinated and sometimes unsettled the settlement. Leah, now 4 years old, was reading simple texts, a skill almost unheard of for someone her age. She would sit for hours with books, absorbing information with a hunger that reminded Jakob of himself. But unlike Jakob, who had hidden his reading from judgmental neighbors, Leah made no secret of her abilities. Young Samuel, at 3, displayed leadership qualities that seemed beyond his years. When children gathered to play, they naturally organized around him, following his suggestions and looking to him to settle disputes. He had a way of speaking that commanded attention, even from adults, who found themselves listening to his observations with surprised respect. Miriam, the youngest at just over a year, was already showing signs of inheriting her mother's healing intuition. She would toddle over to sick animals in the barnyard and place her small hands on them gently, seeming to sense their distress. Ruth watched her daughter with knowing eyes, recognizing the gift being passed down through generations. The Miller family's prosperity continued to grow. Ruth had reopened her father's blacksmith shop, which had been returned to her as part of Yoda's restitution. She hired a skilled young man named Ezra to run it, creating jobs and providing services the settlement badly needed. The shop became profitable quickly, adding to the family's wealth. Jakob's reforms brought wider prosperity to the settlement. His insistence on fair practices and shared resources lifted many families out of poverty. The cooperative grain silo he proposed allowed smaller farms to store and sell their crops more efficiently. The community store he helped establish provided goods at fair prices without the markup that traveling merchants had charged. But with success came resentment from those who felt left behind or threatened. Samuel Brenneman's quiet campaign against the Millers gained momentum. He recruited men who had prospered under Yoda's corrupt system, men who had received favorable treatment and now saw their advantages disappearing. He also found allies among the stubborn traditionalists who believed that change itself was dangerous, regardless of its benefits. Sarah Kaufman brought a warning to Ruth one afternoon. She had overheard Samuel speaking with a group of men at the trading post, his words carefully chosen but clearly hostile. "He's planning something for the harvest festival," Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. "I couldn't hear all the details, but he mentioned public accusations and witnesses who would testify against Jakob." Ruth felt ice settle in her stomach. The Harvest Festival was the settlement's largest annual gathering, when everyone came together to celebrate the year's bounty and give thanks. It would be the perfect venue for a public attack, with the entire community present to witness it. She shared Sarah's warning with Jakob that evening. He listened carefully, his expression troubled, but not surprised. "Samuel has hated us since you refused his marriage proposal years ago," Jakob said. "That kind of bitterness doesn't fade, it only grows. What will you do, Ruth?" Jakob was quiet for a long moment, staring at the carved seal that sat on his desk, the symbol of his authority and responsibility. "I want to believe that if we simply continue doing what's right, the truth will prevail. That Samuel will see reason and abandon whatever he's planning." Ruth shook her head. "Some men's hearts are closed by envy, Jakob. They can't be opened by truth or kindness. Sometimes evil must be confronted directly, not waited out." They debated late into the night. Jakob's inclination was to prepare a defense, but hoped that Samuel would reconsider. Ruth argued for a preemptive strike, exposing Samuel's plot before he could execute it. They finally compromised on a middle path. They would gather evidence of Samuel's planning, prepare their defense, but give him one final chance to step back from the precipice. David Stoltzfus agreed to help investigate Samuel's activities. Over the next week, he quietly spoke with men Samuel had approached, piecing together the shape of the plot. What he discovered was worse than they had feared. Samuel had created an elaborate scheme to accuse Jakob of the same kind of corruption that Yoda had practiced. He had forged documents showing fictitious transactions, recruited witnesses through blackmail and bribes, and prepared a detailed accusation that would be difficult to disprove without extensive investigation. His plan was to present everything at the Harvest Festival, creating such scandal that Jakob would be forced to step down from the council in disgrace. David's investigation uncovered something even more troubling. Samuel had been stealing from his own family's stores and blaming the thefts on the influence of Jakob's reforms. He told neighbors that the new way of doing things had corrupted him, that the emphasis on prosperity rather than piety had led him astray. It was a calculated move designed to turn Jakob's success into evidence of moral decay. The days before the festival were tense. Jakob announced plans to present new community initiatives at the gathering, unaware that Samuel intended to hijack the event for his attack. Ruth prepared their defense quietly, organizing documents and lining up witnesses who could testify to the truth if needed. The Miller children sensed the tension in their home, even at their young ages. Leah, perceptive beyond her years, asked her father directly one evening, as he tucked her into bed, "Why do some people hate us when we try to help?" Jakob sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully, because kindness reveals their own unkindness, and that's painful to see. When someone sees you doing good, it holds up a mirror to their own choices. Some people respond by trying to do better. Others respond by trying to tear you down so they don't have to face that mirror. Leah absorbed this thoughtfully. "But we should keep being kind anyway." "Always," Jakob confirmed. "No matter what others do, we keep being who we are." Ruth had a similar conversation with young Samuel, who had noticed the worried looks between his parents. She knelt down to his level, her hands on his sturdy shoulders. "Strength isn't just physical or being smart," she told him. "Real strength is doing what's right when doing what's wrong would be easier. Remember that, no matter what happens." The night before the festival, Jakob visited his father's grave, something he did when facing difficult decisions. He stood in the quiet cemetery as the sun set, speaking aloud to the man who had shaped his character. "I did what you taught me, Papa. I saw Ruth truly when others saw only surface. I've tried to lead with fairness and transparency, but now someone wants to destroy what we've built, and I don't know if simply standing firm will be enough." The wind rustled through the trees, and Jakob felt a sense of peace settle over him. His father had taught him to see truly, to value substance over appearance, to lead with integrity. Those lessons had brought him to this point. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had lived according to those principles. Ruth made her own pilgrimage that night, to her mother's grave on the other side of the cemetery. She touched the weathered stone marker and thought about the woman who had taught her about healing and strength. "You told me worth comes from within, not from what others think," Ruth whispered. "Tomorrow I'll have to prove I believe that. Give me courage, Mama." She returned home to find Jakob on their porch, staring out at the darkened fields. They sat together in silence for a while, drawing strength from each other's presence. Finally, Ruth spoke. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we built something real. They can't take that from us." Jakob took her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "We showed them a different way. Even if we fall, the seed is planted. Others have seen that it's possible to lead with fairness, to value people truly, to build prosperity through cooperation rather than exploitation. That doesn't disappear even if Samuel succeeds." Inside the house, their 3 children slept peacefully, unaware that the next day would determine their family's future. Leah dreamed of books and learning, Samuel of organizing and leading, Miriam of healing and helping. They were the fruit of an unlikely union, children born from a marriage that the community had scorned but that had proven stronger than anyone imagined. The morning of the harvest festival dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of autumn day that made Pennsylvania glorious. The air was crisp, the leaves brilliant with color, the sky impossibly blue. Jakob and Ruth dressed carefully, Ruth pinning her mother's silver locket at her throat. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of her mother, a reminder of where she came from and the strength she carried. They loaded their children into the cart along with their contributions to the festival, Ruth's famous apple butter and Jacob's best cider. As they drove toward the settlement center, they could see other families converging from all directions. The entire community would be there. Hundreds of people gathered for celebration. Samuel Brenneman watched from his own cart as the Miller family approached. His moment had finally arrived. Years of bitterness and planning were about to come to fruition. He would expose Jakob as a fraud and Ruth as the source of corruption, and he would watch their fall with satisfaction. At least, that was his plan. The harvest festival transformed the settlement's central square into a place of celebration. Long tables groaned under the weight of contributed food, pies and breads and roasted meats filling the air with mouth-watering aromas. Children ran between the tables, their laughter rising above the steady hum of adult conversation. Musicians tuned their instruments, in preparation for the evening's dancing. The entire community had turned out, dressed in their finest clothes, ready to give thanks for another year's survival and prosperity. Jakob took his place with the other council members at the front of the gathering. As the newest elder, he would be giving a significant address about the settlement's future direction and the new initiatives he hoped to implement. He had prepared his speech carefully, outlining plans for a larger cooperative grain silo, expanded community resources, and educational opportunities for children. The festival proceeded through its traditional stages. Elder Byler opened with a prayer of thanksgiving. Various families presented reports on the year's harvests, most of them reporting better yields than in previous years. The mood was optimistic, a stark contrast to the crisis atmosphere that had prevailed under Yuda's corrupt leadership. When Jakob's turn came to speak, he stood and faced the assembled community. He saw friendly faces, Sarah Kaufman smiling encouragement, David Stoltzfors nodding support. But he also saw Samuel Brenneman standing near the back, his expression intense and eager. Jakob's stomach tightened. Whatever was coming would happen soon. Jakob began his address, speaking clearly about the progress the settlement had made and the opportunities that lay ahead. He was midway through outlining the cooperative grain silo proposal when Samuel's voice rang out, cutting through his words like a knife. "Before we hear more lies, the truth must be told." The crowd went silent instantly. Every head turned toward Samuel, who stood holding a sheaf of papers high above his head. His face was flushed with righteous anger, or what he wanted people to perceive as righteous anger. "Jakob Miller stands before you as a reformer, a man of integrity," Samuel declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "But I have evidence that he's no better than Yod. He's been stealing from the community fund, taking payments from families in exchange for favorable treatment, enriching himself while pretending to serve you all." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible and collective. People turned to their neighbors, whispering urgently. Jakob stood frozen, the accusation hitting him like a physical blow. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of everyone he knew was worse than he had imagined. Samuel strode forward, his papers rustling. "I have documents showing false transactions, money moved from community accounts into Jakob's personal holdings. And I have witnesses, good men who will testify to his corruption." 3 men stepped forward from the crowd, their faces grim. Jakob recognized them, farmers whose situations had not improved under his leadership, men who had benefited from Yoda's favoritism and resented its loss. They looked uncomfortable, but determined, clearly prepared to give damaging testimony. Samuel presented his forged documents to the council members, pointing out figures and transactions that supposedly proved Jakob's guilt. The papers looked official, complete with dates and amounts that would be difficult to disprove without extensive investigation. It was a masterful fabrication, designed to create doubt even among those who trusted Jakob. "These are serious accusations," Elder Byler said slowly, his face troubled as he examined the documents. "Jakob, how do you respond?" Jakob tried to speak, but Samuel shouted him down. "You gave Yoda no chance to defend himself. You exposed him immediately and demanded his removal. Why should Jakob receive different treatment? Why should he have time to manufacture excuses?" The crowd murmured agreement. The parallel to Yoda's case was damning. Jakob had been quick to judge the former elder, producing evidence and demanding immediate consequences. Now the same standard was being applied to him, and the symmetry had a certain appeal to those watching. Jakob looked out at the crowd and saw doubt spreading across faces that had been friendly moments before. He saw people he had helped, families whose situations had improved because of his reforms, now questioning whether his motives had been pure or self-serving. The foundation of trust he had built was cracking under Samuel's assault. Ruth stepped forward from where she had been standing with the other women. Her hand went to the locket at her throat, her mother's locket, drawing strength from the connection to the woman who had taught her about courage. Every eye turned to her as she moved through the crowd, her bearing dignified despite the whispers that followed her movement. "These are lies," Ruth said clearly, her voice carrying across the gathering without her needing to shout. Samuel rounded on her, his expression twisting with contempt. "The heavy woman speaks. Perhaps she's the true thief, manipulating her fool husband with unnatural means." Ruth didn't flinch at the insult, though Jakob saw pain flicker briefly in her eyes. She had endured such mockery for most of her life, but it still had the power to wound. Yet she stood straight, her chin raised, meeting Samuel's hateful gaze without backing down. "I know something about being falsely accused, Samuel Brenneman," Ruth said calmly. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly, to have people assume the worst about you based on nothing but prejudice and malice." She turned to address the crowd directly, her voice growing stronger. "How many of you came to me in darkness, asking for healing for your children, for your wives, for yourselves? How many of you were too ashamed to be seen seeking help from the woman everyone mocked, but desperate enough to come anyway?" Slowly, reluctantly, hands began to rise throughout the crowd. Dozens of people, then more, acknowledging that Ruth had helped them when they needed it most. Mothers whose children had been saved from fever, men whose wounds had been treated, families who had received care that the distant doctor could never have provided in time. "How many of you prospered after Jacob became elder?" Ruth continued. "How many of your farms produced better yields because you followed his advice? How many of your families have more security now than under Yudah's corrupt leadership?" More hands rose, though some people looked conflicted, caught between gratitude and doubt. Samuel saw his advantage slipping and played his final prepared card. He produced additional papers, documents he claimed were evidence of Ruth's witchcraft. "She grows herbs that shouldn't survive in Pennsylvania soil," Samuel declared. "She has knowledge that no natural woman should possess. I say she bewitched Jacob at the bride market years ago, clouded his judgment with dark arts, and has been controlling him ever since." The accusation struck at old superstitions that ran deep in the community. Some people in the crowd stepped back from Ruth, fear replacing doubt on their faces. The whispers grew louder, more agitated. Jacob saw the situation spiraling beyond Samuel's accusations about embezzlement into something far more dangerous. Then young Samuel Miller, only 3 years old, walked forward through the crowd. His small figure moved with surprising purpose, weaving between adults until he stood directly in front of his parents. The child's presence commanded attention in a way that seemed impossible for someone so young. "My mama heals people," the boy said, his voice clear and steady. "My papa helps people." Why is helping people bad? The simple question, delivered with a child's pure logic, cut through the rising hysteria. Adults who had been ready to believe the worst found themselves confronted by innocence that demanded a real answer. Why was helping people bad? When stripped of all the rhetoric and accusations, that was the fundamental question. Leah joined her brother, standing beside him with her hand in his. "We love our mom and papa," she said. "They teach us to be kind and work hard and help others. That's what they do." The sight of the Miller children, so young yet so earnest, defending their parents with simple truth, shifted something in the crowd's mood. These were not the children of corrupt, evil people. They were well-loved, well-taught, remarkable in ways that spoke to good parenting rather than dark influences. Sarah Kaufman seized the moment. She pushed through the crowd to stand beside Ruth, her voice ringing with authority. "I'll tell you why Samuel Brenneman really hates the Millers. Years ago, before Ruth went to the bride market, Samuel proposed marriage to her. Ruth saw the cruelty in his heart and refused him. This vendetta has nothing to do with corruption or witchcraft. It's about a bitter man's wounded pride." Samuel's face went red, then white. "That's not relevant," he sputtered. "I'm talking about crimes against the community." "Are you?" Sarah challenged. "Or are you trying to destroy good people because you can't stand to see them succeed where you failed?" The winter of 1892 arrived with unusual harshness. Snow fell early and heavy, and the cold settled into the valley like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. But it wasn't just the weather that troubled Maple Hollow. The previous summer's crops had failed across much of the settlement, a combination of late frost and insufficient rain that left many families struggling. Elder Yoder called an emergency meeting at the church in January, summoning all the men of the settlement to discuss the community's financial crisis. Jakob attended, sitting near the back with the other farmers, listening as Yoder outlined the dire situation. "The community fund is nearly depleted," Yoder announced, his voice grave. "Many families are facing the loss of their farms. Children are going hungry. We must take immediate action to preserve our settlement." He proposed severe measures, increased tithes from those who could still afford them, strict austerity for all families, and the possibility of land seizures from those who fell too far behind in their obligations. The room erupted in worried murmurs. These were harsh solutions that would cause tremendous hardship. Jakob listened carefully, his mind working through the numbers. Yoder had presented. Something didn't align with what he knew about the settlement's finances. His own farm had weathered the poor harvest reasonably well, thanks to Ruth's careful planning and diverse planting strategy. They had sufficient stores and even a modest surplus. But according to Yoder's accounting, the community as a whole was on the brink of collapse. When the meeting opened for discussion, Jakob raised his hand. "Elder Yoder, I have questions about the accounting. The numbers you've presented suggest total crop failure across the settlement, but I know for certain that at least a dozen farms had adequate harvests. Where did those yields go in your calculations?" Yoder's expression darkened. "Are you questioning my accounting, Jakob Miller? Do you dare suggest that I would misrepresent our community's situation?" "I'm asking for clarity," Jakob replied evenly. "As members of this community, we have a right to understand how our contributions are being managed, especially when such severe measures are being proposed." Several other men nodded in agreement, emboldened by Jakob's question. David Stoltzfus, a young farmer who had taken Jakob's advice on crop rotation and benefited greatly, stood up. "I'd like to see the ledger as well, if that's permitted. My family will be affected by these measures, and I want to understand the full situation." Yoder's face flushed with anger. "This is highly irregular. The Elder Council has always managed the community fund without such scrutiny. Your lack of trust is offensive and inappropriate." But Jakob persisted, his voice calm but firm. "My father taught me that transparency builds trust, while secrecy breeds doubt. If the situation is as dire as you say, showing us the accounting will only strengthen our resolve to help. If you refuse, it raises questions about why you're afraid to share the information." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Other council members exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable. Thomas Byler, who had shown fairness during Ruth's hearing, spoke up. "Jakob raises a reasonable point, Elder Yoder. In times of crisis, transparency can help unite the community. Perhaps we should allow inspection of the ledger." Yoder had no choice but to agree, though his reluctance was obvious. "Very well, I'll bring the ledger to the next council meeting. Those who wish to examine it may do so, though I consider this lack of faith deeply troubling." Jakob left the meeting with a knot of unease in his stomach. Yoder's defensiveness had only strengthened his suspicions that something wasn't right. That evening he discussed it with Ruth, who listened thoughtfully as she nursed their third child, a daughter they had named Miriam. "Trust your instincts," Ruth advised. "You've always been able to see what others miss. If something seems wrong, it probably is." Over the next few days, Jakob spoke quietly with other farmers, asking about their actual harvest yields and comparing them to what Yoder had reported. The discrepancies were significant. Several farms had produced adequate crops, but according to Yoder's numbers, they had all failed. Jakob began to suspect that the elder was either grossly incompetent or deliberately dishonest. 5 years passed like water flowing steadily downstream, each season bringing changes that accumulated into transformation. The autumn of 1898 found the Miller family gathered around their oak kitchen table, now scarred and aged from years of use. Each mark a memory of meals shared and decisions made. Jakob and Ruth sat at opposite ends, their 6 children filling the spaces between them, a living testament to the union that had begun with scorn and grown into something remarkable. Leah was 9 years old now, a serious child with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's practical intelligence. She had been tutoring younger children in the settlement for the past year, teaching them to read and calculate with a patience that belied her age. Parents brought their children to the Miller farm for lessons, recognizing that Leah possessed not just knowledge, but the rare gift of being able to share it effectively. Samuel, at 8, had organized the settlement's youth into workgroups that helped families during harvest and planting seasons. He had his mother's organizational skills and an innate understanding of how to motivate people. Even adults found themselves following his suggestions, impressed by his ability to see the most efficient way to accomplish tasks. Miriam, now 6, spent her days in Ruth's garden and clinic, learning the healing arts with the same intuitive grasp her mother had shown. She could identify plants by touch, seemed to sense when someone was ill before they showed symptoms, and had gentle hands that soothed both people and animals. The 3 younger children, twins David and Rebecca, at 4 years old, and baby Martha just past her first birthday, each showed early signs of their own exceptional qualities. David had a gift for working with wood and metal, his small hands surprisingly deft at crafting. Rebecca possessed a musical talent that made visiting musicians stop and listen when she hummed. Martha was too young to reveal her gifts fully, but her alertness and quick responses suggested she would be no less remarkable than her siblings. The settlement had transformed along with the Miller family. Jacob's leadership over the past 5 years had brought unprecedented prosperity. The cooperative grain silo stood tall at the settlement's center, allowing farmers to store and sell collectively, getting better prices than individuals could negotiate. The community store provided goods at fair prices without middlemen taking excessive profit. Education had expanded beyond basic scripture reading to include practical mathematics, natural science, and critical thinking. Ruth's healing practice had evolved into a formal clinic, a small building near the church where she treated patients and taught other women the medical arts. She had trained 6 apprentices who could handle common ailments, freeing Ruth to focus on more serious cases and the continued development of her knowledge. Her journal of remedies and treatments had grown into multiple volumes, a comprehensive medical text that documented not just recipes, but observations about what worked and why. The blacksmith shop that had once belonged to Ruth's father now employed 6 workers and served 3 surrounding settlements. It had become a center of innovation, with Ezra and his team developing improved tools and implements that made farming more efficient. The income it generated supported several families and contributed significantly to the community fund. Other families had risen alongside the Millers, lifted by the tide of fair practices and shared prosperity. Young farmers who had once struggled now owned successful operations. Women who had been relegated to purely domestic roles discovered talents for trade, teaching, and leadership. The settlement buzzed with activity and optimism, a stark contrast to the fearful, suspicious place it had been under Yoda's corrupt rule. The old guard, those who had resisted change and clung to traditional hierarchies, had largely faded. Some had died of natural causes. Others had moved away to settlements more aligned with their values. A few, like Elder Byler, had adapted and found themselves energized by the new direction. The settlement's leadership now included younger voices, women's perspectives, and a commitment to transparency that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Samuel Brenneman had returned to the settlement after his period of exile, humbled and working quietly as a carpenter. He kept his distance from the Millers, but Jacob occasionally saw something in his former adversary's eyes that might have been grudging respect or perhaps simply resignation. Samuel's farm had been sold to pay his debts, and he now rented a small workshop where he did competent but unremarkable work. His story served as a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of envy. A visitor arrived from a neighboring settlement one afternoon in late October. A leader who had heard stories about Maple Hollow's transformation and wanted to see it for himself. Jacob and Ruth showed him around, walking through the cooperative silo, the community store, Ruth's clinic, and the thriving blacksmith shop. The visitor observed everything with keen interest, asking questions and taking notes. "How did you accomplish all this?" he asked Jacob as they stood on a hill overlooking the settlement. "I've heard the stories, but seeing it is something else entirely. Your community has gone from corruption and suspicion to prosperity and cooperation in just a few years." Jacob looked out over the valley, seeing the farms spread below, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving about their work with purpose and contentment. "It started with seeing worth where others saw burden," he said quietly. "Everything else followed from that." The visitor followed Jacob's gaze and then observed the Miller children playing in the yard below. Leah was reading to her younger siblings. Young Samuel was organizing a game. Miriam was with the twins something in the garden. "Those six will change the world someday," the visitor said with conviction. Ruth joined them on the hill, and Jacob reached for her hand. Automatically, the visitor noticed the gesture, the easy affection between them, and smiled. "You two are quite a pair," he said. "The settlement speaks of you with something approaching reverence." Ruth laughed softly. "They speak with gratitude, perhaps, but we're just people who decided to build something better than what we inherited." That evening, after the visitor had departed and the children were preparing for bed, the family gathered one last time around the oak table. It had become tradition for Jacob to ask each child to share something from their day, a practice that kept the family connected despite their increasingly busy lives. Leah announced proudly that one of her students had read an entire book independently for the first time. Young Samuel reported that his work group had helped 3 families complete their fall planting a week ahead of schedule. Miriam described treating a horse's injured leg, applying a poultice that had reduced the swelling dramatically. The twins shared their own small triumphs, and even baby Martha babbled something that her siblings insisted was meaningful. When the children had finished, young Samuel asked the question they requested periodically, never tiring of the origin story. "Tell us about the bride market again." Jacob and Ruth exchanged a glance, the look of 2 people who had lived a lifetime together and understood each other completely. Ruth began the story as she always did, with honesty about how difficult those years had been. "I stood at the end of the line knowing no one would choose me. I had stood there before, watching other women be selected while I remained. I thought I knew exactly how the day would end, with me returning to my aunt's house, still unwanted, still a burden." Jacob picked up the thread. "Your mother was the strongest, smartest, most capable woman there. I paid triple the asking price, not because I was foolish or desperate, but because I finally saw what should have been obvious to everyone. She was worth far more than they were asking, and you were the wisest, kindest, bravest man to see it," Ruth added, the words part of their familiar rhythm. The children listened raptly, even though they had heard this story dozens of times. They understood that it was more than just a tale about their parents. It was a lesson about seeing truly, about recognizing worth that others overlooked, about having the courage to act on your convictions despite social pressure. "You taught us to see what others miss," Leah said thoughtfully. "That's the most important thing, isn't it? Not just being smart or strong or talented, but seeing people truly." Jacob felt pride swell in his chest. His children understood. They had learned the lesson his father had taught him, and they would carry it forward into their own lives and pass it to their children in turn. As the evening drew to a close and the children headed upstairs, Jacob and Ruth remained at the table, hands clasped between them. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lamplight flicker against the walls of the home they had built together. "We built this together," Ruth said softly, echoing words she had spoken years before. "No," Jacob corrected gently, as he always did. You were already built. I just saw it." Ruth smiled and squeezed his hand. After all these years, his ability to see her truly still moved her deeply. She looked at the wall where Leah had drawn and hung a family tree, showing the 6 children's names with space left below for future generations. "Our children will do remarkable things," Ruth said with certainty. "They'll lead this settlement and maybe beyond. They'll carry forward what we started." Jakob nodded, knowing she was right. Their unlikely union, born from a moment of clear seeing at a bride market years ago, had produced children who would reshape their world. The heaviest bride and the farmer who had seen her worth had started something that would ripple through generations. The settlement of Maple Hollow would continue to transform, guided by the values Jakob and Ruth had lived and taught. Their children would indeed rule the town, not through force or manipulation, but through the same qualities their parents had demonstrated, seeing truly, valuing substance over surface, leading with integrity and compassion. As Jakob extinguished the lamp and they climbed the stairs together, both understood that their story was really just beginning. What they had built would outlast them, carried forward by 6 remarkable children who had learned to see the world the way their father had seen their mother that day at the bride market, with eyes that looked past the surface to recognize true worth. The tale of the Amish farmer who paid triple price for the heaviest bride would be told for generations in Maple Hollow and beyond. But those who understood the story best knew it wasn't really about a bride market or a price paid. It was about recognition, about love that sees truly, about the remarkable things that happen when someone has the courage to value what others dismiss. It was about building a legacy, not through wealth or status, but through the simple revolutionary act of seeing people as they truly are. The winter of 1899 brought unexpected challenges that would test the Miller children in ways their parents had not anticipated. A harsh cold settled over Pennsylvania, temperatures dropping lower than anyone could remember. The settlement's livestock suffered, and several families faced the prospect of losing animals that represented their entire livelihood. Leah, now 10 years old, organized the younger children into reading groups that met in the warmest homes, ensuring education continued despite the weather. But her real contribution came when she remembered a passage from one of her father's books about insulating animal shelters. She sketched diagrams showing how to pack straw and mud around barn walls to retain heat, a technique no one in the settlement had considered. Young Samuel, hearing of Leah's idea, immediately mobilized the youth work groups he had formed. Boys and girls aged 8 to 16 descended on struggling farms, working in organized shifts to implement Leah's insulation method. The children worked with remarkable efficiency, Samuel directing them with the natural authority that made adults shake their heads in wonder at his young age. Jakob watched his children lead this effort with quiet pride. He offered guidance when asked, but mostly stayed back, recognizing that this was their moment to step into leadership roles. Ruth felt similarly, though she prepared hot meals and remedies for the young workers who returned exhausted each evening. The insulation technique worked better than anyone expected. Barns that had been frigidly cold became noticeably warmer, and the livestock mortality rate dropped dramatically. Families who had been preparing to slaughter animals they couldn't keep alive through winter found they could preserve their herds after all. The children had saved the settlement from potential disaster. Elder Byler approached Jakob after Sunday services in January. "Your children are remarkable, Jakob. Leah's knowledge, Samuel's leadership, even young Miriam treating frostbite cases. They're barely more than children themselves, yet they're serving this community like seasoned adults." "They learned by watching," Jakob replied simply. "They saw their mother heal people despite being mocked. They saw me stand up to corruption despite the risks. Children learn more from what they see than what they're told." But not everyone viewed the Miller children's prominence positively. A faction of older families, led by a man named Elias Yoder, elder Yoda's nephew, began expressing concern about the influence the Miller family wielded. Elias had returned to the settlement after years away, and he brought with him rigid views about proper order and traditional hierarchies. "It's unnatural," Elias said during a community meeting in February. 6 children from one family dominating every aspect of settlement life. The Miller boy organizing our youth, the Miller girl teaching our children, all of them treated like they're special when they should be learning humility and obedience. Sarah Kaufman, now in her 60s but still sharp-minded, responded immediately. "The Miller children serve this community because they have abilities worth using. Would you rather our children go uneducated, our livestock die, our people suffer because you're uncomfortable with competence that comes from the wrong family?" The debate revealed a generational divide. Older members who remembered the rigid hierarchies under Elder Yoda's corrupt rule felt threatened by how much influence one family held. Younger families who had benefited from the Millers' leadership saw no problem with recognizing and utilizing exceptional ability, regardless of age or family origin. Jakob addressed the concern directly at the next council meeting. "My children are not seeking power or control. They're using their gifts to serve others, which is exactly what we should want from every member of this community. If anyone feels threatened by children helping people, perhaps they should examine why competence and generosity make them uncomfortable." The council voted to formally recognize the contributions of all young people in the settlement, not just the Millers, establishing a youth council that would have a voice in community decisions. Young Samuel was elected to lead this council, with Leah serving as education coordinator. It was unprecedented, giving children official standing in settlement governance. But the results of the winter crisis had proven their value. Ruth watched these developments with mixed feelings. She was proud of her children, but also aware that prominence brought danger. People who felt threatened might take actions against her family, and her children were still young enough to be vulnerable, despite their capabilities. One evening she shared these concerns with Jakob as they prepared for bed. "We've given them tools and taught them values, but the world isn't always fair to those who stand out. I worry about what might happen as they grow older and their influence expands." Jakob pulled her close, understanding her fear, because he shared it. "We can't protect them from everything, but we raise them to be strong, to think clearly, to act with integrity. Whatever comes, they'll face it together, and they'll have each other." Outside their window, snow continued to fall on Maple Hollow, blanketing the settlement in white silence. Inside the Miller home, 6 children slept peacefully, unaware that their childhood acts of service were laying foundations for something far larger than anyone yet imagined. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal, but it brought with it a crisis that would test not just the Miller children but the entire settlement's commitment to the values Jakob and Ruth had worked so hard to establish. A telegram arrived at the trading post in early April, carried by a rider from the nearest town. It contained news that sent ripples of concern through Maple Hollow. The state government was proposing new regulations that would fundamentally change how Amish settlements operated. Mandatory schooling laws would require all children to attend state-approved institutions. Agricultural inspections would impose standards that many small farms couldn't meet. Property taxes would increase substantially, threatening families who operated on thin margins. The regulations represented an existential threat to the settlement's way of life. If enforced strictly, they could destroy the community that had survived for generations. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time in the settlement's history, the Youth Council was invited to participate fully in the discussion. Elias Yoda spoke first, his voice heavy with doom. "This is what comes from deviating from traditional ways. We've allowed women to have authority, children to lead, reforms that attracted attention from the outside world. Now the government seeks to control us. We should return to the old ways, become less visible, less threatening to their order." David Stoltzfus countered immediately. "The old ways included corruption and suffering. We're prosperous now, educated, healthy, That's what attracted attention, not our reforms. The question isn't whether to go backward, but how to move forward while preserving what matters most. The debate raged for hours, with older members generally favoring isolation and younger ones advocating engagement. Jakob listened carefully to both sides, recognizing truth in each perspective. They needed to protect their way of life without surrendering the progress they'd made. Leah raised her hand, waiting to be recognized. When Elder Byler nodded to her, she stood with a composure remarkable for a 10-year-old. "I've been reading about these regulations," she said clearly. "The schooling laws have exceptions for communities that can demonstrate educational adequacy. The agricultural standards allow for traditional methods if they meet safety and productivity benchmarks. The tax increases can be negotiated based on community hardship." She produced a sheaf of papers covered in her neat handwriting. "I've drafted a proposal showing how our current education system meets the state's requirements. Samuel has documented our agricultural practices and yields. Miriam has compiled health records, proving our community's well-being. We can negotiate from a position of strength rather than simply resisting." The room fell silent as adults absorbed the fact that a child had done more thorough research and preparation than any of them. Young Samuel stood beside his sister. "We can send a delegation to the state capitol. We can show them that our way of life produces educated, productive, healthy citizens. We don't have to choose between preserving our values and satisfying their regulations." Jakob felt his throat tighten with emotion. His children had understood something crucial that many adults had missed. The choice wasn't between isolation and surrender, but between thoughtful engagement and reactive resistance. "Leah's proposal has merit," Jakob said carefully. "But this is too important for one voice to decide. We should vote on whether to pursue negotiation or isolation." The vote revealed the settlement's division clearly. The older generation largely voted for isolation, wanting to retreat from outside scrutiny. The younger families overwhelmingly supported negotiation, trusting in the Miller children's research and the strength of what they had built together. The deciding vote came from an unexpected source. Elias Yoder stood slowly, his expression troubled but resolute. "I've been arguing for the old ways because I feared losing what defines us. But I've watched these children save our livestock, educate our young, and heal our sick. If they say we can protect our way of life through engagement rather than isolation, perhaps we should trust the wisdom of the generation that will inherit what we leave behind." His vote tipped the balance. The settlement would send a delegation to negotiate with state authorities. Jakob would lead it, but he insisted that Leah and Samuel accompany him. "They did the research," he explained. "They understand the regulations better than I do, and it's their future we're negotiating." Ruth supported the decision but privately worried about her children traveling to the state capitol and facing government officials. They were still young, still vulnerable to the harshness of a world that didn't always value what made them special. The night before the delegation was to depart, the entire Miller family gathered around their oak table one last time. Jakob looked at each of his children, seeing in them the fruit of everything he and Ruth had built together. "You understand that this journey might be difficult," Jakob said seriously. "Officials in the capital may not respect you because of your age. They may dismiss your work or mock your background." Leah met her father's eyes steadily. "You taught us that worth isn't determined by what others think. Mama showed us that strength means standing firm, even when people mock you." "We'll be fine, Papa." Young Samuel nodded. "And we'll have each other. That's what family means." Ruth stood and embraced each of her older children, whispering words of encouragement and love. Then she turned to Jakob, her eyes bright with emotion. "They're ready. We raised them for this." The delegation left at dawn, 3 generations traveling together. Jakob drove the cart while Leah and Samuel sat behind him, reviewing their documents and preparing their arguments. Sarah Kaufman had volunteered to stay with Ruth and help manage the younger children, understanding that Ruth would need support during the days of waiting and worrying. The state capitol overwhelmed the senses in ways Maple Hollow never could. Buildings rose several stories high, their brick and stone facades imposing and cold. Carriages and wagons clattered over cobblestone streets in endless streams. People rushed past in clothing far fancier than anything worn in the settlement, barely glancing at the plainly dressed Amish family making their way toward the government offices. Jacob felt out of place but maintained his composure, drawing strength from the knowledge that their cause was just. Leah and Samuel walked beside him, their eyes wide at the sights but their bearing dignified. They had dressed in their finest plain clothes, carrying leather satchels containing all their carefully prepared documents. The Department of Rural Affairs occupied the third floor of an imposing granite building. A secretary looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from bored indifference to barely concealed condescension when she saw their clothing. "We have an appointment with Director Hamilton," Jacob said calmly. "Jakob Miller and delegation from Maple Hollow Settlement." The secretary checked her ledger with exaggerated slowness. "The director is very busy. You may have a few minutes, but please be concise. He has important matters to attend to." They were kept waiting for over an hour in a hallway with hard wooden benches. Other petitioners came and went, most of them looking far more sophisticated and worldly than the Miller delegation. Leah used the time to review her documents one final time while Samuel observed everything around them with his characteristic intensity. Finally they were ushered into Director Hamilton's office. He was a large man in his 50s, well-fed and prosperous-looking, with the air of someone accustomed to authority and deference. His desk was massive, covered with papers and official seals. He barely looked up as they entered. "Maple Hollow Settlement," he said, consulting a file. "You're here about the new regulations. I should tell you that these policies are not negotiable. They're designed to bring all communities into compliance with modern standards. Your concerns, while noted, won't change the outcome." Jacob felt anger rise but kept his voice level. "We're not here to complain, Director Hamilton. We're here to demonstrate that our community already meets your standards in substance, if not in form." Hamilton finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "Every settlement claims to meet standards. Few actually do. The Amish are particularly resistant to progress and oversight." Leah stepped forward, her small figure somehow commanding attention. "May I present our documentation, sir?" Without waiting for permission, she placed a thick folder on his desk, open to a specific page. "This shows our educational outcomes. Every child in Maple Hollow can read, write, and calculate by age 8. We teach practical sciences, mathematics, and critical thinking alongside traditional subjects. Our literacy rate is 98%, higher than the state average." Ironman's eyebrows rose slightly as he scanned the page. "This is impressive record-keeping for a rural settlement." "I maintain the education records," Leah said simply. "I can provide testing samples, student work and assessment results, if you'd like verification." Young Samuel placed his own folder beside Leah's. "Our agricultural practices produce yields 15% above regional averages. We use crop rotation, soil conservation, and selective breeding. These documents show 5 years of production data, all properly recorded and verifiable." Hamilton was leaning forward now, his skepticism giving way to genuine interest. He paged through Samuel's agricultural data, making small sounds of surprise at the thoroughness of the documentation. Jakob added the final piece. "Our community health records, maintained by my wife who serves as our healer, show lower infant mortality, longer life expectancy, and better overall health than comparable rural populations. We don't oppose progress, Director Hamilton. We've simply achieved it through methods that honor our traditions while meeting modern standards." The director spent the next hour reviewing their materials, asking pointed questions that Leah and Samuel answered with remarkable competence. He tested their knowledge, challenged their data, and tried to find weaknesses in their arguments. But the Miller children had prepared too thoroughly, and their documentation was too complete. Finally, Hamilton sat back in his chair, studying the three people before him with new respect. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, he said slowly. "I've never seen a rural community present such comprehensive, well-organized evidence of their capabilities. Most groups come here to complain or beg for exceptions. You came to prove you've already exceeded our requirements." He pulled out official papers and began writing. "I'm going to recommend full exemption from the standard regulations for Maple Hollow, with a provision that you submit annual reports documenting continued compliance. You'll pay standard property taxes, but at rates adjusted for agricultural communities. And I'm going to use your settlement as a model when discussing what rural education and development can achieve." Jacob felt relief wash through him, but it was Leah who spoke. "Thank you, Director Hamilton. We appreciate your fairness in evaluating our documentation rather than simply dismissing us." Hamilton smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his stern face. "Young lady, in my experience, people who do thorough work deserve thorough consideration. You and your brother have done remarkable work for one so young. Your community should be very proud."